our partners to come and really give their perspective of what came down during this legislative session, what things we should be paying attention to, what passed, what didn't pass, and where we go from there. So that's what we'll be doing today. We'll be hearing from each of these panelists, and then we're going to leave a little bit of room for a Q&A session. So stand by for that at the very end. And I am Katie Brooks. I'm the CEO of the Bend Chamber of Commerce. And what I'd like to do is start us off by introducing a little bit more detail of who our panelists are. So Morgan Greenwood is a Vice President of Government Relations for the Central Oregon Builders Association. In her role, Morgan works with the development community across Central Oregon to advocate for local and state policies to reduce barriers to build and increase housing supply. John Stark is the CEO of EDCO, and he's responsible for leading the organization and accomplishing its mission to create a diversified local economy and a strong base of middle-class jobs in Central Oregon. EDCO advocates for policies to create economic incentives to support our region as a whole. And then Sarah Odendahl is the Director of Government Affairs and Strategic Initiatives for the Bend Chamber. In her role, she leads the Chamber's local and state policy work to support the Chamber's key priorities and initiatives. So, Sarah, we're going to start off with you. We thought we'd start with a quick overview of the Bend Chamber's key initiatives just to set the stage, and then we'll get into more of a panelist presentation and discussion. So Sarah, why don't you take it?
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. And welcome to everybody out there in cyberspace. This is kind of interesting to do a webinar after we've done so many of these in person. Now we got to get used to doing the online thing again. So thanks for taking the time over the lunch hour. So Katie asked me just really quickly to review where the Bend Chamber policy priorities started out this session, and then you'll hear from the three panelists today on kind of where things ended up as of last Sunday when session closed. So each year the Chamber sets a set of legislative priorities based on input from the Board of Directors. This year we have about 6 different key buckets or policy areas that we're working in, and I'm just going to review each one of those really quickly. So the first is to take a look at how do we rebuild a business-friendly state and ensure sustainable funding absent additional impacts on business. This is something I think as business owners and members of the business community, you all know historically there have been challenges in terms of tax burdens and regulatory burdens placed on businesses. In fact, earlier this year, OBI, one of our partners at the state level, conducted a study alongside the Oregon State Chamber of Commerce, asking employers about what were the barriers and what were their thoughts around the business climate. And shockingly, about 440 folks responded, and 74% of those respondents said the regulations, the tax structure in Oregon was really complicating and challenging for their business. So that really led to our first legislative policy priority, which was to address doing no harm, keeping things relatively status quo without future impacts on the business community in terms of taxation and regulatory. The next policy priority, which we'll hear a lot from Morgan today, is related to housing. So similarly, we conducted a study late last year by Echo Northwest asking local Central Oregon businesses and employers, how did housing impact your ability to hire, recruit, retain? And shockingly, 91% of the 200 respondents said that high cost of housing here in our region has significantly constrained their ability to grow their business and be able to be successful here in Central Oregon. So that led to our second policy priority, which was to increase the supply of attainable housing, workforce housing specifically in the area median income of around 80% to 120%. So this is what we refer to as the missing middle in terms of the housing crisis that we're seeing right now. The third piece, which we'll hear more from John Stark on, is to promote economic vitality, workforce development, and innovation to create a vibrant business community here in Central Oregon. So this includes supporting incentives and tools to help grow businesses. It includes investments in innovation at our OSU Cascades or Central Oregon Community College, and includes other types of policy levers that can support innovation as we move forward and try to create a healthy business climate. The fourth key policy initiative is related to transportation and infrastructure, which we had a pretty major win on this year, and I'll get to a little bit later. We're excited about, but that includes investments in Midtown crossings, investments in different types of transportation, mobility around our city to allow people to utilize cars or utilize pedestrian and bicycle crossings to be able to move through our city in a more streamlined fashion as we continue to grow. The fifth piece, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is access to affordable childcare. Obviously, we can't have workers and we can't have successful businesses if we don't have access to childcare. Oregon, the entire state is in a childcare desert, unfortunately. Central Oregon, this is not unique to us in Central Oregon. And so we are prioritizing workforce development programs, growing the childcare workforce, and looking at how to incentivize ability to create more childcare centers and more childcare slots, specifically for infants and toddlers, as well as preschoolers. And then the last policy priority that our board set for us this year was regarding a thoughtful balance between environmental sustainability and economic health. This is always a kind of a push and pull. We obviously live in a beautiful place and we want to support the success and the sustainability of our natural resources. So that included monitoring the implementation of a bill that executive order rather that passed last year, the Climate Friendly Equitable City Act. And so we spent some time monitoring that this session, as well as other environmental sustainability legislation regarding wildfire mitigation and forest resiliency and water. So that's a lot of policy priorities. I know we have a big list, and we're going to focus today really on the top three: economic development, housing, and workforce. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Katie.
Great, thanks, Sarah. You're right, it is a lot. So Morgan, we're going to start with you, you lucky duck, and want to start with that housing issue. It was a big deal. I don't know what it is to EDCO, it is to Chamber, it is to all of us. It's pretty much all we ever talk about anymore, it feels like. So I've got a few questions that I want to prompt you with to kind of share what you folks concentrated on and share your observations of what happened and what to expect moving forward. So the first question. So housing was obviously a cornerstone issue for 2023. The governor came out right out of the blocks with her own agenda. What were the key bills that passed or failed this session, and what were your thoughts on those?
Yeah, thank you, Katie. First, just thank you very much for having COBA today. This is a great opportunity to bring housing. As you say, it's pretty much all we talk about anymore, but I still think that the more conversations we have about it, the more momentum we can build toward building solutions that address some of these issues. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank the Chamber for their excellent advocacy on housing over the mountains. So it's been great to work with you, and it's been wonderful to see housing become such an integral part of economic development policies as well. So specifically, yeah, what passed and what failed? Let's talk about what passed, because a long time ago, way back in March, Governor Kotek signed her executive order that created the goal of developing 36,000 housing units a year for the next 10 years. This is, I can't overstate what an ambitious goal this is. That is an 80% increase from our current housing production right now. So in order to help achieve this goal, her executive order also created the Housing Production Advisory Council. This is a 25-member council, all members of which are appointed by the governor, and they are essentially tasked with creating an action plan that is designed to help achieve that goal of housing production per year. They're working on it now. They have been working on it since the spring, and by December of this year, they are intending to adopt a final set of recommendations to be approved by the governor. So that got the session off to a great start. That was literally signed, I think, on her first full day in office. And then in March, House Bill 2001 passed this and was signed by Governor Kotek. This was a massive bill that does a number of things. Out of the gate, it allocates $200 million in housing and funds to mitigate homelessness. 27 million of those dollars came over the mountains to help address homelessness in Deschutes, Crook, and Jefferson counties. The other really critical thing that House Bill 2001 did was it required cities with a population of over 10,000 to essentially set individual development targets for units of housing per income level. This sounds like kind of a tedious or nitpicky administrative goal, but the fact that jurisdictions have not been required to do that so far means that there is not enough housing. There aren't enough housing types produced for certain income levels. They just aren't. They aren't factored into the goals of the cities in their housing production goals. So now they are required to outline these specifically. The other kind of neat thing about 2001 is that it creates a publicly available dashboard that helps the public actually track those jurisdictions' individual goals. It sets up some accountability measures for these jurisdictions. And then it also requires the Department of Land Conservation and Development to streamline UGB expansions by reducing some of the analytical burden, by reducing some of the redundancies, essentially by eliminating some of the areas that are usually up for some legal contestation. So that provides jurisdictions a lot more certainty going forward through the UGB expansion process, and so that's going to help in our area in particular quite a bit. I will say there were some pretty neat wins for rural housing this session. I know that this doesn't affect City of Bend directly, but a lot of the employers that are on the call today have folks that live in rural communities and outside of UGB. So I think it is important that because we are all in the commute shed that we stay aware of what is applicable in rural communities as well. In particular, House Bill 3197 requires counties to create clear and objective standards for housing. That's another one of those picky analytical things, but frankly, it gives developers a lot more certainty going forward, and eliminates more nebulous requirements like neighborhood compatibility and more indefinable characteristics. Those are no longer applicable to housing developments in rural communities. So like I say, this requires the counties to amend their development code. So they have 2 years to amend their development code to integrate clear and objective standards for housing outside of city limits. So that's a great win for rural housing. In addition, last session, one of the areas of concern was regarding the provision for folks to build ADUs in rural areas. That had been tied to the wildfire bill, and we all remember the excitement surrounding that bill last session. We did get a fix for those wildfire maps, and in addition to that, we also created the provision for ADUs to be built on county lots as long as they meet certain wildfire mitigation standards. So those can be done even before maps are adopted, which is a really exciting opportunity for housing outside of city limits.
Great, thanks for that. My question is in regards to land supply. Obviously, it continues to be a debate among lawmakers, advocates, everybody else. So what change do you see on the horizon for the state and the local level? And maybe you could touch on the bill that didn't pass, 3414.
Yeah, I was trying to stay so upbeat, Katie, but the sadder news that came out of this session on literally the last hour of the last day was that what has been colloquially referred to as the governor's bill, House Bill 3414, did not pass, passed just by very narrow margins, did not pass. House Bill 3414 would have done a number of things, and as Katie referred to, it also would have provided for a one-time expedited UGB expansion of no more than 150 acres. So I will say that because 3414 included so many good things, I'm quite confident that will not be the end of it. I think, quite frankly, I was preparing a little bit for a hail of executive orders after session closed. We don't seem to be headed that direction, but I think that we can be optimistic about a short session. And if not this summer, then I expect that it will be picked up in 24 as well.
Yeah, let's hope so. Next question is just around infrastructure, and there are a lot of bills around this, a lot of discussion around. We all know one of the reasons why housing is so difficult to develop is because the infrastructure costs are really high, and especially in Central Oregon when everything is lava and nothing is easy to dig out, like utilities, et cetera. So those costs are especially a sensitive issue here. Can you talk a little bit about funding for infrastructure related to housing development? What highlights do you want to bring forward, and how do those funds actually make its way into Central Oregon and Bend specifically?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the whole concept of development readiness is kind of a shorthand way of talking about how difficult it is to put infrastructure into the ground. I mean, it's expensive regardless of where you are, and as you know, Katie, it's more challenging when you're digging up lava. I think that that's one of the things that could have been addressed in 3414. There was also provisions for infrastructure development in a couple other bills that failed this year. I would refer back, I think, to that housing production advisory council, and I know that development readiness, shovel-ready properties is high on their list of achievements, of recommendations, essentially, and goals to achieve. So I look forward to seeing what that recommendation package looks like in December. Like I say, I'm quite confident that infrastructure will be addressed through their recommendations. I would also note, if I can just talk about something a little closer to home. The Deschutes Board of Commissioners on Monday approved a $1 million contribution to a newly created workforce housing trust. This is intended to create a developer credit for homes that are deed restricted to employees within Deschutes County who make between 80 to 120% AMI. So this developer credit can be applied toward infrastructure, applied toward permit fees, applied toward land acquisition costs, applied toward SDCs. So really excited to see some local solutions coming to the fore here, kind of picking up where the legislature has left off. So this is a great kind of homegrown solution that I think can start to address some of those very steep infrastructure costs. Additionally, the city of Bend has about $500,000 available for their own workforce housing program. So excited to see individual jurisdictions recognizing the need and finding creative ways to address that here.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to bring up, that mid-market. When we're talking about workforce, I think more specifically, it's people who are earning area mean income between 80% of area mean income, which is around what, 65K per household, all the way up to 120+%. It's the middle class that used to be able to buy a house in Central Oregon and are finding it very difficult to do. And so the city of Bend has their own program, and this program through the county is also a really exciting development in that world of folks who are looking to buy the first home, for example. So Morgan, thanks. Those were great overviews. I do want to take a quick moment to say, if any of you on this call, on this Zoom meeting, have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. That's where I'll go to pick them up and ask the questions after all the presentations are done. So pop them in there and I'll bird dog them for you, and we'll ask as many as we can. But we're going to move on right now to John Stark, and we're going to talk about economic development and some of the legislation that passed through the legislature this year. And John, I'm going to start off with asking you what you perceive were the key economic development bills that passed this session. Why don't you share your perspective on what passed, why it was important?
Yes, a lot of things passed, and some of them had some good content, but some of them had some devastating content. What passed? Well, one of our priorities was to support semiconductor resources for our semiconductor industry across Oregon, and in particular here in Central Oregon. And while our footprint for semiconductor for direct manufacturing is pretty small, about 4 companies, there are a lot of suppliers that support the semiconductor industry, whether it's direct parts or parts for their facilities. And so Senate Bill 4 was a big one. We testified in front of the Semiconductor Committee on that one. That brings a number of tools, a loan program to companies who will apply for the federal CHIPS Act. And we hosted a panel not long ago with 3 of those 4 companies about what was important to them, all of which have already applied or investigated application to the CHIPS Act. And they've now been directed with EDCO's help to begin application for SB4 funds. It also provides technical and financial assistance to those applications. And then additionally, some governor authority to help move along lands ready for the UGB. So we begin to, like housing, address some of the land needs that this industry needs to grow here in Oregon. And we've got a ton of land that needs infrastructure support. So additionally, we were watching in the R&D tax credits that were likely to be part of a semiconductor package, but ultimately were not. They were actually dropped into House Bill 2009. So we did get some R&D tax credits linking back to the federal code, about $255 million in R&D tax credits. That's really important to the semiconductor industry, but it also includes advanced manufacturing companies, and we have a lot of those. If you extend semiconductor to advanced manufacturing, think about primary metals, right? Where we make parts, whether it be welding, fabrication, machining. We might make a part, an OEM to something, but advanced manufacturing is really using metal, and can include wood products as well. But generally speaking, they're talking about those that support semiconductor. So R&D tax credits came through a major bill that we were working on, House Bill 2009. Our number one priority was to extend the Oregon Enterprise Zone program, which is our number one tool in Central Oregon to help companies move, start, and grow here on the high desert. It's a property tax abatement program for companies investing in buildings or machinery and equipment. They've got to create at least one new job if they're moving in, and they've got to add 10% to their existing employment if they're already here. It provides 3 to 5 year property tax exemption under the standard program and 7 to 15 year property tax exemption under the long-term rural. Long-term rural is not available to be used in Bend or Redmond, but it is available to be used in our smaller communities such as Jefferson County and Crook County. 2009 did extend the program for another 10 years, but there's some strings attached. So we accomplished the goal of getting extended, but the strings attached are there's now a community service fee that is to be negotiated between the school districts and the zone sponsor between 15 and 30% of the property tax value to be abated under the program. And so it waters down the program. We oppose that. Thank you, Ben Chamber. You were involved in a number of legislative priorities, this being one of them, and you signed on to a number of our pieces of testimony along the way. We oppose that, along with opposing a piece that requires Business Oregon to be a technical assistance advisor. Now, these provisions only affect the 4 and 5 year property tax exemption where there's an agreement between the zone sponsor and the company. So a 3 year doesn't have any additional provisions, but a 4 and 5 year, what we call the extended abatement, and the 7 to 15 will have these provisions. Additionally, the zone manager, which EDCO manages all 5 zones here in Central Oregon, will have to post it on the zone sponsor, in our case, the cities and counties in the region, on their website, this agreement for at least 21 days before it becomes effective, just so there can be full transparency and folks that may have comments about it, and the school district can see it, fire marshals and so forth, see what the impacts are within a community. Additionally, the zone sponsors are to consult neighboring jurisdictions for additional impacts, such as, roads and streets that may not be part of, for example, the city of Bend. It might be an ODOT piece of infrastructure. So we opposed all of those provisions because it further complicates a program that's already pretty complex. And a lot of other states don't have these types of complexities in their property tax abatement program. The last thing I'll say is it also can create some inequity across communities, right? Because if one community negotiates a 15% school district fee and another community right next door negotiates a 30%, well, the 15% community is more competitive, and it might encourage folks, depending on their availability of sites and so forth, to move in that space. 2009 also added gain share, which repays some of the income taxes that are created by jobs back to communities who are abating taxes, and extends the SIP program, the Strategic Investment Program, which is one we haven't used a lot because it kind of starts at 25 million and then the investment above is what is abated. But it's one that we've had on the table for some of our projects. And then finally, the R&D tax credits, the 255 million is in there. It basically creates an excise tax credit allowed for qualified research activities that sets an increased maximum amount, limits the use of the credit to semiconductor and advanced manufacturing companies. And the last two I'll mention, we had industrial site readiness through a program called Regionally Significant Industrial Sites. We were trying to get some funding into that program. The program exists, but we were trying to get some funding into it and extend the sunset. We weren't successful with that, but we were successful through the Business Oregon budget and through House Bill 5030 to gain $30 million in lottery bonds to support the Special Public Works Funds, which is a program that allows grants and loans to local communities for job creation and economic development projects. So that was a win. And then the Business Oregon budget I mentioned, HB 5524, did pass. We use that program for technical assistance and innovation grants and so forth as well. And then this is a new one, Katie, you may not have heard this, but House Bill 3416 is $20 million for the state, $500,000 to OSU. And that is for Cascades to outfit a fabrication and maker space at the university in order to support prototyping of new products for outdoor. So that's pretty unique. I just got word of that yesterday. It wasn't even on our radar, but one of our colleagues up there. And then finally, I'll just finish with this. HB 2816, we killed that bill early on in the session. It was a carbon tax bill effectively on data centers. And of course, we've got a few of those up in Prineville and in Bend, as well as a smaller one in Redmond. And so we opposed that. We worked really hard. Frankly, I should thank Emerson Representative Levy for her behind the scenes work to get us in front of the chair of that committee where eventually it was killed. So that's those are the things that were on our radar and what happened from our perspective.
Yeah, quite a few things. So John, talk to us about the cat tax and some of that stuff and why we were hopeful. It was like a roller coaster ride. Yay. Oh, yay. And it ended up in the downside. So why don't you talk a little bit about what happened with that?
So the commercial activities tax is a tax on gross receipts. It's kind of a hidden sales tax that it can multiply or compound. So if you manufacture it, you're taxed. It's 0.57% under the original legislation. And then that entity taxes the distributor, and the distributor might tax the retailer. So it could be taxed as many as 3 times by the time it gets to the end user. So that's the history of the cat tax. It was one that many of our traded sector businesses said was really a painful thing to absorb. And a lot of the companies in your mix of businesses at the chamber have very low margins, so it's very difficult for them to pay for those. Some of you bought cars recently. It does say in the invoice, this is for to do the privilege to do business in Oregon. So the cat tax, Senate Bill 140, and there was a companion bill on the House side, look to take the lowest thresholds. So it was 750,000, but it kicked in at $1 million and increased that somewhere between 3 and 5 million. So you wouldn't start paying the tax until you had gross receipts of 3, 4, or 5 million. That was part of the back and forth. Is it 3 million? Is it 4 million? And then ultimately they said, okay, well, if we reduce that, we lose some revenue. We're going to charge more to those higher taxpayers. So it became revenue neutral. And so my understanding, 140 did indeed die, as did in the companion bills. But I did see a note that Bill 2073 may have passed. And that is really dealing with cat tax for agricultural food producers.
Oh.
I've not had a chance to dive into that to see exactly what that means. But suffice to say, the larger cat tax reform that we'd all hoped for didn't occur. And the CPAs are reeling at the moment because they get a lot of noise on that tax as well. We're investigating 2073 with one of our CPA firms to see exactly what it means to our traded sector businesses, much of which are up in the north end of Central Oregon. So we had some hope. We played a tennis match, and ultimately we're not successful for cat tax reform.
Next year.
Hopefully, I think there's a will by several to do
Yeah,
that.
we had some positive conversations early on and at the midpoint. So hopefully that's something we can keep chipping away at. All right, so I'm going to leave my last question to the end. I might come back to you, John. Really appreciate that insight. So many important things going on, and just so everyone knows, there just aren't a lot of tools in the state of Oregon to attract and retain businesses. And EDCO and other EDOs, economic development organizations across the state, do such a great job trying to figure out how to work the tools that we do have as best as we can. And it's why this stuff is so important. It's one of the only ways that we can really compete. So thanks for that, John. So housing, economic development, there were hundreds of other things that were made across the finish line. And Sarah, if you don't mind, I'd like to just have you talk a little bit about a few things. And specifically, I wanted to talk about childcare, because there was a lot of legislation that went through. Some was more policy oriented, but there was also some significant funding. So if you don't mind, could you go over what pieces of legislation passed and what they meant to childcare?
Sure thing. Thanks, Katie. So I think before we start the conversation around childcare, I think just a bit of a update around why there were such significant investments in childcare and education and some of these other things is our budget, our state budget, was significantly higher than projections even just earlier in this calendar year. So lawmakers initially thought that they were going to have to start trimming budgets and limiting spending a bit more. And the state actually ended up with a significant overage in terms of projected revenues. So that really allowed some flexibility in terms of these policy priorities and the investments, really truly transformational investments that they were able to make in these key areas, one of which being childcare. So, childcare has been a big issue for the chamber for a number of years. We've done a lot of work here locally and then advocated time and time again at the state level for ways to increase access to quality, affordable childcare, increase the provider ratios, increase the ability for centers to open and be able to manage their businesses. So there were a couple of key pieces of legislation that passed, and then an investment vehicle as well. The first one I'll mention is House Bill 2727. And so this directs the Department of Land Conservation to take a look at studying the impact of land use regulations regarding childcare siting. So they need to do this in conjunction with the newly formed DELC, Department of Early Learning and Care. And basically this work group is going to be examining land use regulations, zoning ordinances, building codes, permitting practices, all of those types of things that have an impact on the ability for childcare centers to open and operate in an efficient manner here across the state. So that's exciting. It's a work group, it's a study. It's not something that's going to be producing immediate results, but there is movement and traction towards opening up this broader discussion on how do we make this an easier industry to get into for folks that want to help support our families and our employers with childcare options. The second piece that I would mention is House Bill 3005. This was a priority of the budget, of the governor. And this creates an early childhood infrastructure fund. It's a grant and loan fund that is going to be administered by Business Oregon in coordination with the Department of Early Learning and Care. And basically what this does is it helps existing childcare facilities be able to utilize resources through grants or loans to be able to expand, to create new spaces, and basically come up with funding for the infrastructure to support what they need. As you know, childcare centers are not just operated in shell buildings. They have little tiny toilets, and they have little tiny sinks, and they have little tiny everything, all required by code and regulatory oversight. And so this bill really helps to address some of the challenges, the infrastructure challenges that childcare providers are going to be seeing as they are opening these businesses. I also would note that our partners over at Central Oregon Community College did receive additional funding through one of the budget bills to be able to expand childcare offerings at their Madras campus. And so that's super exciting. We've long partnered with COCC and OSU Cascades to address the childcare issue and the implications on the workforce here. And so it's exciting to see some additional funds go their way in the city of Madras.
Right. Great synopsis. So every session there seems to be something, a new protocol or new requirement of businesses. So what do you think? And there were many that came through this session, but what do you think the top 3 policy changes were that businesses should be aware of that ended up coming out of the 2023 session?
Sure. So yeah, I would say overall business, the business community fared pretty well this session as compared to prior sessions. In prior sessions, we saw the enactment of the CAT tax. We saw the enactment of additional regulatory reforms. This year, we didn't see a ton of new regulatory reform. I think what I shared in my opening comments regarding kind of the sentiment of businesses here in Oregon, I think lawmakers heard that. Maybe not as much as we would have liked necessarily, but I think there really truly was an attempt to look at impacts of legislation on businesses and making sure that we do have a sustainable business climate here in Oregon. So the policies that I will say will have some pretty immediate impacts all actually have been passed and talked about in prior sessions, but had some codifying legislation this year. So the first of which is the Family Medical Leave alignment. So the state of Oregon has had the Oregon Family Leave Act, OFLA, for a number of years. In 2019, the Paid Family Medical Leave Insurance Program, also called Paid Leave Oregon, was passed. And so there has been a couple of years of regulatory and rulemaking to create this new insurance program. But at the same time, we have the leave program and we have the insurance program, and they weren't aligned. And so as we have started collecting premiums from employees, and as employees are going to start being able to access the program coming up in September, there needed to be alignment in terms of how an employee could take leave under OFLA and take leave under Paid Leave Oregon. And so Senate Bill 999 put together some alignment between those two programs to ensure that definitions were the same for leave, that timelines were the same, that there was no ability to really stack the leave on top of each other, and really just created an environment to be able to implement this coming up in September when things go live. So that's the first one. The second one has to do with universal healthcare. And this is something that we passed on the ballot a couple of years ago. And so this year, the legislature passed a bill, Senate Bill 1089, which creates a universal healthcare governing board. And so this board is going to be taking a deeper dive into looking around how to set up the comprehensive single-payer insurance health plan by September 2026 and give recommendations for the 2027 session. So this is going to be expensive. This is going to be upwards of $20 billion, 10 billion of which are anticipated to come from employer tax contributions. And so this has really significant impacts on businesses here in Oregon. And I think time will tell. This is untested waters in terms of other states. No other state to this point has set up its own universal healthcare program to this level. And so we're kind of treading new water here. And this board was, I think, the first step. And so something we're going to be looking at as they begin their work in advance of these recommendations. And then the last piece, I would just say regulatory reform in general. So there were a number of bills that unfortunately didn't pass. I think there was appetite, similar to what John had mentioned around the cat tax. There's appetite to make some movement there. There's definitely appetite to do some regulatory reform. Our partners at Oregon Business and Industry had a pretty significant regulatory reform agenda this year. That included taking a look at permitting at state agencies, the regulatory processes, the establishment of an Office of Business Ombudsman. Unfortunately, neither one of those did pass, but I think that the climate is ripe to bring those back in the future and hopefully be able to use those tools to be able to better advocate for businesses at the legislature in future sessions.
Thanks for that. So workforce development and education. What legislation went through this year that was significant?
Yeah, so education was a huge priority. We heard this from both the legislature as well as from the governor coming out of the gate. It was housing, it was education, it was looking at opioids and substance use, behavioral health. So the budget that I mentioned earlier really allowed some flexibility in terms of investments in education. And so the two key pieces I think that the legislature invested in were the K-12 budget. The K-12 budget was set at $10.2 billion, which is about $700 million more than current service levels. And this is what school districts across the state were asking for and what the governor had, even more than the governor had laid out in her initial budget proposal. So this combined with local property tax revenues and the corporate kicker that goes back into the school fund will basically take a look at putting about $15.3 billion towards K-12 education. So that includes the whole continuum in terms of educating our future workforce. The other piece I think that's significant is addressing early learning. So, we're addressing childcare, we're addressing kind of preschool readiness. Oregon is woefully behind in literacy rates. And so there was a bill to invest $140 million in the Early Literacy Success Initiative that was sponsored here locally by our Representative Kropf, representing Bend. It was House Bill 3198. And basically this is going to create some grant programs for local communities and school districts to avail themselves of to increase literacy, as well as giving teachers different tools, different options, and different ways to increase literacy rates amongst our early learners, 3rd grade and below. So those are two pieces I think that are really significant when you're taking a look at education investment overall, that will have some pretty significant impacts as we move forward.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. So I want to turn to some of the questions that we're getting in from our participants today, our attendees. The first question is around federal workforce housing programs. We're concentrating mostly on state legislative stuff, but there are some intersections. And Morgan, I think that House Bill 2001 may have some overlapping interests with federal workforce housing programs and investments. Am I right about that? You're on mute. There you go.
There you go. Yeah, and in fact, I just want to give folks there's another opportunity to learn more about this. The organization called YIMBY is actually hosting a great webinar next week with Representative Frost, Maxwell Frost, to discuss this exactly. So that will be something to definitely take advantage of and get more information on from a federal perspective.
So YIMBY is yes in my backyard.
Yeah, thank you.
For y'all who don't know.
Yeah.
Folks supporting building more housing for everyone. Next question, House Bill 2980 and 2981 that directly address providing funding for middle and affordable housing related to infrastructure, had a lot of support. And so her question is, they did fail to get over the finish line this session. Any insights as to why? And what are the prospects for the return of these bills? And can Central Oregon groups help lead that effort?
Yeah, I think I will just say, This was a unique session for obvious reasons. I think that if I had to guess, these bills didn't get as much traction as they should have, because it's totally accurate that they had very broad support from a number of groups and bipartisan support as well. I think that the decision was made to focus on the big bills to try to get as much bang for the buck this session. So having said that, I am quite confident that we will see these return.
Yep, the abbreviated session really did condense a lot of things, and you had to pick your battles, that's for sure. All right, Sarah, did you have
I
anything
just,
to add?
I was just going to weigh in on that. We, the chamber was a really active partner with COBA and with Central Oregon Land Watch, and with just a really interesting City of Bend, a really interesting collaborative group of partners here locally in Central Oregon to support these bills. And we offered testimony, we lobbied directly during one of our days at the Capitol. So I think, to Morgan's point, I think that, we were able to tell the story really well around infrastructure and the unique infrastructure needs we have, a la the lava in the ground. And, unfortunately, these bills just kind of fell victim to the broader political issues that were going on this session. But I do think that there is a will amongst Central Oregon organizations here to get those addressed next year, and really start to take a look at how do we address the infrastructure challenges here and put some funding behind our needs.
Along those lines, Sarah, so there is a little happy news to share with that collaborative effort in getting infrastructure funds in relation to the Central District and the Hawthorne overcrossing. Do you want to share the news?
Absolutely, yeah. So a press release just went out earlier this week, but the Chamber and the City of Bend and Central Oregon Land Watch were lead on supporting requests at the federal level and the state level to support the Hawthorne overcrossing. This is one of the 3 Midtown Crossings packages, infrastructure pieces, and we were awarded $5 million through ODOT's discretionary funds, bonding authority, and then $20 million from a federal discretionary grant fund as well. So that $25 million to help support the building of the Hawthorne overcrossing, which will link the Central District, the Core District, and really provide the kind of transformational catalytic change to that community, and really be able to be a bridge between East and West, which we're super excited about. There's so many reasons. It's not just infrastructure, it's housing, it's workforce, it's a connected community. And so I think this was like all hands on deck with those partners, and we're just super thrilled that we were able to secure those resources and move this project forward.
Yep. John, this next one's for you. So the EFU zones, I mean, all of us have been working on this, but you take this on, because I know this is spanned across several sessions. So the question is around EFU zones rated non-suitable for ag or for farming. We've been trying to get some latitude in order to incorporate them into the urban growth boundary, the UGB, to be rezoned for mixed use, residential, et cetera. So this will help with housing, with commercial, sometimes industrial. So where do you see that going, John?
Well, it's pushing rope uphill, unfortunately. The land use system for expanding UGBs in Oregon is one of the hardest of all states in our country. We actually have a situation up in Madras. We're trying to go a different route by designating about 195 acres through COIC's large lot industrial program. And that is farm use or agricultural, not EFU, but agriculturally zoned. The fact is, though, if you were to take a drive up in Madras, you'd see, not all the land up there is being used for farming. A lot of these farms are for sale. The drought has created some challenges. So how can we, one, sustain, our food production through agriculture? And two, if we aren't using those lands, what else could they be used to be productive to our economic development? And so that is going to be an uphill battle because it's been around for a long time. And there is a lot of EFU just outside of UGBs that would be suitable for housing, commercial, and industrial land uses. So I think our Economic Development Association, Oregon Economic Development Association, along with our partners at League of Oregon Cities and Association of Oregon Counties and OEDA, will likely be at the forefront of that conversation, just because at the end of the day, we need more land, but at the same time, there are groups out there that, advocate for preservation. And I think it's a balance. We got to be, thoughtful to all the things, whether it be our natural resources or agricultural land. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't have a suitable use, meaning the ground isn't fertile, then we should make that easier for acquisition.
Yeah, that kind of ties into House Bill 3414 that was trying to annex urban reserves that have been designated. It's linked to that kind of an effort as well. And hopefully we will have a special session so we can go back at that and get it passed. So I want to wrap things up here with going around the virtual room and offering you 1 to 2 of your top priorities going into the 2024. It's a short session, but with all that happened that didn't happen, what do you think is the most important thing for your organization to walk away from in the 2024 session? So I'm going to reverse, and John, you're going to go first.
Thank you, Katie. Well, this has been a theme for everyone that spoke today: infrastructure support. We've got 2,000 acres of larger lot industrial throughout the region that needs infrastructure support. And the cities and counties can't shoulder all of that themselves, nor can the developers. We do have some issues with regard to land use at the state and how we can extend infrastructure as properties come into the UGB to address, but infrastructure support dollars back to communities or back to the developers in order to get roads and streets and below utilities in place is a big one for us. And then further workforce development tools such as workforce training. Because we're watering down some of these incentives that we have, one of the fallbacks we've had for years is the OJT program. We can offer up on-the-job training for incumbent workers with a match from companies. We'd like to support that. Heather Ficht has been advocating for that for years to get more funding into that. Those are 2 fairly sizable pieces of legislation that would be important for us. And obviously, we'd support you on a lot of the housing work that you've done. We can't be all things to all people, so we certainly appreciate all the work the Chamber's done on housing and childcare, and we'll put our shoulder behind you where applicable.
It takes a village to pass legislation, just saying. All right, Morgan, I'm going to let you go next.
Well, I hate to sound too predictable, but infrastructure funding for all of the reasons that John just so eloquently outlined. I think the other one that is important to us, of course, is land supply. And one of the things, John, when you your response to Katie's question about EFU, I would be really excited to see some process, something developed to talk about land swaps, because you're exactly right. There is land zoned EFU that is not productive, cannot be productive, and is unlikely to be. So figuring out a land swap process would be in concert with some infrastructure funding would be a great strategy.
That's really an intriguing idea. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by land swap?
Sure. We have 6 minutes, Katie. I'll go fast. I think the big deal is just that if you can't expand your UGB in order to increase land supply, you can at least get rid of land that that cannot be that isn't developable, that is currently within your UGB. So it's essentially just areas where you have adjacency of infrastructure, bring that into the UGB. Areas where you can't get infrastructure, you can let that go, and it doesn't count toward your buildable lands inventory.
Thanks. Yeah, really, really cool idea. Sarah, bring it home.
Okay, well, I think the role of the chamber that we play is really, to John's point, not to be everybody to everyone, but to really partner with a diverse set of organizations across the state. So that's state level partners, it's local partners. So continuing on that theme of collaboration, I think the housing piece is going to continue to be our #1 priority moving forward, workforce housing and that 80 to 120 AMI, and really like micro focusing on that missing middle, because there was some movement, there was discussion. I think missing middle housing came up more often than it's ever come up before in terms of sound bites at the legislature. So it's definitely in people's forefront, but how do we support all the things, the infrastructure, the land supply, the cost to develop, then the potential deed restricted properties that we could look at creative ways to get people into home ownership. So I think continuing those collaborative discussions and really moving forward on some of these pieces that may have stalled and didn't get past the finish line are going to be huge. And then the second piece for us, I think, is going back to our roots, and what we do here is support businesses. And so supporting a business-friendly state and creating an environment that is looking at responsible regulatory reform, taking a look at bringing that cat tax discussion up again, not placing a burden on higher paying tax categories that John had mentioned. So, really going back to the roots of let's not do no harm to business and make sure that we have a healthy economy here to support our growing community.
Right. Yeah, I think if you did a word cloud of everything that was said in the legislature, I think housing would be the biggest word. Probably. Well, John and Morgan and Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today. And it was a good overview, I think really relevant to businesses here in Central Oregon, of how all of us worked on so many different pieces, both separately and collectively. And I'm really, really proud to be part of this region, because this is the modus operandi. All of us do things in concert with one another, and it makes us more powerful to compete with the voices that are on the other side of the bump, right? On the other side of the Cascades. And we really do show up in Salem. And I appreciate every one of you for all the work that you've done. I also appreciate Cascade Insurance Center for making sure that we could put this on today. And thank you to all the participants that were joining us today and the attendees. This will be recorded and on our website. And really thank all of you for your time today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Katie.